Morning came softly to the desert town, as if afraid to disturb it. Pale light slipped over cracked sidewalks and low rooftops, touching windshields, mailboxes, and the long, empty road that led out toward the open land. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing unusual, the kind people forgot minutes after it passed. Calico left her house just after breakfast. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake the stillness that clung to the rooms behind her. Her bike leaned against the porch rail, paint chipped from years of use. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the front door, then pushed off into the street. The sound of her tires against asphalt faded quickly, swallowed by distance. Inside the house, her mother rinsed a coffee mug and set it upside down to dry. She listened to the radio while folding laundry, half aware of the time, fully certain that Tara would be home later. There was no argument, no farewell heavy with meaning, just another ordinary morning, stacked neatly beside all the others. By noon, the heat settled in. The phone remained silent. Her mother checked the clock once, then again, irritation giving way to something thinner and sharper. Tara was late, but lateness had never scared her before. She told herself a story she could live with, a longer ride, a friend's house, a forgotten sense of time. By evening, the story stopped working. The porch light came on automatically as the sky darkened, casting a yellow circle onto the empty steps. Her mother stood in the doorway longer than necessary, scanning the road. Each passing car raised hope, and then crushed it just as quickly. She dialed Tara's name into the phone, listening to the hollow ringing, again and again, until the sound itself became unbearable. There was no scream, no dramatic collapse. Fear arrived quietly, like a stain spreading through fabric. It filled the house room by room, settling into the corners where Tara's presence still lingered. A jacket hung over a chair, a book lay open on her bed, proof that she had existed, and that she should have returned. Night deepened, the desert cooled. Still, Tara did not come home. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug long gone cold, staring at the door as if willing it to open. She replayed the morning in fragments, searching for signs she might have missed. A tone in Tara's voice, a look that asked for help. Nothing rose to the surface. Nothing ever does at first. Somewhere beyond the town limits, darkness stretched endlessly. Roads led away and did not return. The desert had a way of keeping what it took and offering no explanations in exchange. By the time the first knock came, the house already felt different, heavier, changed. Her mother rose slowly, heart pounding, knowing without understanding that something irreversible had begun. The town slept on unaware that an ordinary morning had quietly turned into a before, and that Calico now existed only in the space between unanswered calls and an open road that led nowhere. Tomorrow, neighbors would notice the silence. Questions would form, cautious and incomplete, carried across fences and whispered in grocery aisles. A name would be spoken softly, then avoided. For now, the night held everything still. The porch light burned, the phone stayed quiet, and a mother waited, not yet knowing how quickly a single absence could begin to reshape an entire town. Nothing in this place would ever feel ordinary again, though no one yet understood why fully.
The next morning did not bring answers. It brought people. By sunrise, the porch light was off, but the house felt exposed, as if the night had peeled something away. Neighbors began to arrive with cautious faces and practiced sympathy. They spoke softly, asked careful questions, and avoided staying too long. Concern showed itself in gestures, not commitment. At the grocery store, Tara's name passed from mouth to mouth like something fragile. Conversation stopped when someone unfamiliar walked too close. Eyes slid away instead of meeting one another. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the one who said it aloud. The town had seen disappearances before. Not many, but enough to develop habits. You waited. You hoped. You trusted that things would resolve themselves. That belief allowed people to keep their routines intact. It also gave them permission to do nothing. The sheriff arrived just after noon. He moved with the calm of a man who had learned to pace tragedy. His uniform was neat, his voice even, his questions gentle but controlled. He spoke to Tara's mother in the living room, notebook resting on his knee, eyes lifting only when necessary. He promised to look into it. He promised to keep her informed. His tone suggested process, not urgency. Outside, he spoke briefly with neighbors. Times were noted, details logged. Nothing stood out, which somehow made everything feel worse. When he left, the street returned to its uneasy quiet, like a room after an argument no one wanted to continue. As hours turned into days, Tara began to blur. Flyers appeared on telephone poles and shop windows, her photograph pinned under clear tape. People looked at her face and felt something close to guilt, then moved on. It was easier that way. Memory softened her edges, turning her into a symbol instead of a person who had laughed too loudly and argued with her mother over small things. The whispers grew sharper. Some said she had run away. Others hinted at trouble, at secrets she must have been hiding. Each rumor shifted responsibility away from the town and onto Tara herself. If she had chosen this, then no one had failed her. That idea spread quickly because it was comforting. Tara's mother felt the change immediately. People stopped calling as often. Their concern thinned, stretched tight over their own discomfort. She noticed how eyes lingered on her just a second too long, as if measuring her grief, as if deciding how much of it they were willing to witness. The sheriff checked in once a day, then once every few days. His questions became repeats. His notes grew shorter. He spoke carefully, never promising he could not keep. The case remained open, he said, though the words sounded increasingly hollow. At night, the town returned to itself. Lights went out on schedule. Doors were locked. Life continued in quiet defiance of the empty space Tara had left behind. Only her house resisted the rhythm, holding its breath long after the rest had exhaled. Absence has weight. It presses into conversations, bends behavior, rewrites memory. Tara was no longer a girl who hadn't come home. She was becoming an uncomfortable thought people stepped around, like a crack in the sidewalk they pretended not to see. And beneath the politeness, beneath the lowered voices and careful distance, something else settled in, a shared understanding that looking too closely might reveal things no one was prepared to face. By the end of the week, the town had learned how to look away together without speaking aloud.
The first copy arrived by mail, folded carelessly inside a plain envelope, as if it were nothing more than a receipt or a forgotten bill. Tara's mother opened it at the kitchen counter, her movement slow, already tired of hoping. When the photograph slipped out and landed face up, the room seemed to tilt. It showed two figures, bound and crouched in the back of a van. The image was grainy, poorly lit, caught mid-moment. One face was partially obscured by shadow, the other turned just enough for fear to be unmistakable. A strip of tape crossed the mouth. Wide eyes reflected the flash, frozen in terror that felt immediate and intimate. There was no name attached, no explanation, just the image. By afternoon, copies had multiplied. Someone had shared it with the sheriff. Someone else had contacted a newspaper beyond the county line. Within days, the photograph escaped the town entirely, carried by headlines that asked questions without waiting for answers. Could this be her? Was this proof? Or was it something worse? The town reacted the way it always did when fear became public. People gathered around televisions and radios, leaning closer while pretending distance. They argued details they did not understand, studied the photograph as if clarity might emerge from repetition. The image became a mirror, reflecting whatever each person was most afraid of seeing. The sheriff called for help he could not openly admit he needed. The investigator arrived unannounced, driving a car with plates from far away. He was quiet, sharp-eyed, his skepticism worn like armor. He studied the photograph alone before speaking to anyone, tracing the edges with his gaze, noting what was visible and what was carefully hidden. He did not say whether he believed it was Tara. He said only that photographs lie in subtle ways. Still, the image unsettled him. He spoke to Tara's mother in the same living room where promises had already worn thin. He asked her to look closely, then asked her to stop. Her reaction mattered more than her certainty. He watched her hands tremble, her breath catch, and wrote nothing down. Outside, the town stiffened. Some people leaned into the attention, eager to be seen as helpful. Others pulled back completely, suddenly busy, suddenly unreachable. Old stories resurfaced in pieces, never complete enough to accuse, never weak enough to ignore. The photograph gave shape to fears that had lived quietly for years. At night, the image followed people home. It hovered behind closed eyes, replayed in dreams, crept into conversations that ended too quickly. Parents checked locks twice. Teenagers were watched more closely. The desert beyond town limits felt closer now, its darkness more deliberate. The investigator walked the streets alone, noting the way people avoided his gaze. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing contradictions, sensing the pressure of things unsaid. The photograph had not created fear, it had exposed it. Publicly, officials urged caution. Privately, panic spread. No one could confirm where the photograph came from, when it was taken, or who had sent it. That uncertainty was its power. It demanded belief without proof, dread without direction. It turned memory into evidence and suspicion into currency. Tara's name returned to conversations, but thinner than before, stretched between theories and speculation. She was no longer just missing.
She was possibly captured, possibly alive, possibly suffering somewhere unseen. Hope and horror twisted together until neither could stand alone. Late one evening, the investigator pinned the photograph to the wall of his temporary office. He stared at it longer than he meant to, aware of a quiet shift inside himself. Images like this did not surface by accident. They were meant to be found. And whatever truth waited behind it was not going to stay buried much longer.
The photograph lingered on the investigator's wall, but the story behind it remained incomplete. To understand Tara, he needed fragments, whispers, things left unsaid. He began by sifting through her room, through her journals, notebooks filled with lines written in careful, deliberate pen. Every page hinted at emotions she could not voice, fears she could not name. One entry described a smile she had not shown anyone, the kind that came only when she was alone. Another hinted at a weight pressing on her chest, though she wrote it as a question, a mystery she could not solve herself. There were references to someone she trusted, someone who held authority, who spoke softly, whose presence was both comforting and dangerous. She never gave a name. She never explained the closeness that made her uneasy. Her mother had noticed changes, small shifts in behavior that seemed insignificant at the time. Tara had started walking alone in unusual places, spending longer hours away, answering questions vaguely. Conversations that had been casual became guarded. A glance would linger a second too long. An unfinished sentence would trail into silence. At school, classmates remembered her differently depending on who was telling the story. Some said she had grown quieter, more reserved. Others recalled a spark in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she let on. Teachers noted her diligence, but also her tendency to disappear from sight when the hallways were crowded. The investigator pieced together snippets of conversation overheard from neighbors, teachers, and friends. A casual warning here, a half-joke there, hints at an unspoken tension. There were glances exchanged too quickly to interpret, and hurried explanations that left gaps. Tara existed in a web of observation, in a pattern that seemed ordinary to those watching, but extraordinary in its implication. At home, her journal told another story. Late-night thoughts, questions about trust and betrayal, about who controls whose truth. She sketched outlines of feelings she could not articulate, the kind that made her pulse quicken and her stomach tighten. These notes revealed a young woman aware of danger, but trapped in social and emotional structures she could not escape. One page mentioned a secret, a connection she neither confirm nor deny. The words trembled across the paper, a forbidden bond, a relationship that should have remained hidden. There was admiration, fear, and confusion tangled together. Even in private, she could not fully confront the implications, leaving clues only the observant could notice. The town's silence amplified her isolation. Everyone knew pieces, but no one could speak the full truth. Rumors circulated in fragmented ways, gossip that never reached resolution. Each person who held knowledge carried a weight they could not share. The photograph had externalized her disappearance, but the subtler forces, her unease, her secrets, her boundaries, remained concealed. The investigator realized the case was no longer only about what happened, but about who knew. He saw patterns of influence and manipulation that extended beyond Tara, extending through her acquaintances, into the shadows of authority figures, shaping her world invisibly. Each fragment he collected deepened the emotional and psychological complexity of the story. At night, the room felt alive with absence. The notebooks lay open. The words pulsed faintly, as though Tara's voice persisted in the spaces she had left behind. He read and reread passages, trying to discern the unspoken, attempting to map the invisible currents that had carried her toward danger. By the end of the week, he understood something crucial. The photograph was only one piece of the puzzle. The real story lived in the silences, the omissions, and the fears Tara had never expressed. And those silences, once uncovered, would begin to reshape the investigation, revealing the true stakes of a town complicit in its own inattention. By the time the investigator began asking harder questions, certain names surfaced again and again, always indirectly, always wrapped in praise. Men who sponsored events, coached teams, donated generously, and stood at the center of town gatherings like fixed points everyone oriented themselves around. They were spoken of with familiarity, never suspicion. Respect protected them better than any locked door ever could. The investigator noticed how conversation shifted when these men were mentioned. Voices lowered, sentences softened, facts dissolved into opinions before they could harden into accusations. Authority did not need to announce itself here. It existed quietly, reinforced by years of favors and shared secrets. One man appeared more often than the others. He was known for his charm, for remembering names, for listening just long enough to make people feel seen. He held influence without needing a title that suggested power. People trusted him instinctively, and that trust had become reflex. No one described him unkindly, yet no one described him fully either. The investigator watched him move through public spaces with ease. He laughed easily, touched shoulders lightly, maintained steady eye contact. Nothing about him suggested cruelty. That, the investigator knew, was often the point. Power wore different faces depending on what was required of it. Behind closed doors, stories shifted shape. A former colleague hesitated before speaking, hands clasped tightly together. A neighbor recounted an uncomfortable interaction, then immediately dismissed it as nothing. Each account ended the same way, with uncertainty and self-blame. Fear did not always look like terror. Sometimes it looked like gratitude mixed with confusion. Tara's name rarely appeared in these conversations directly. When it did, it was framed carefully, almost defensively. She had been sensitive, some said, misunderstood, easily influenced. Each description subtly moved responsibility away from anyone else. The pattern was familiar and deeply practiced. The town's silence began to feel deliberate. People knew how far to go and where to stop. They had learned which questions were safe and which were not. The investigator sensed an unspoken agreement holding everything in place, stronger than loyalty, older than the case itself. This was not just about protecting men. It was about protecting a system that had rewarded obedience for years. He requested records. Some arrived incomplete. Others were delayed without explanation. Doors that had opened easily before now closed with polite finality. The sheriff remained cordial but distant, emphasizing cooperation while offering little of substance. No one outright refused help. They simply gave nothing useful. Late one afternoon, the investigator reviewed Tara's journal again, this time through a different lens. Certain entries felt clearer now. The admiration tinged with fear, the careful wording, the restraint. She had known the cost of speaking. Someone had taught her that silence was safer. In town, people watched the investigation with growing discomfort. Familiar routines felt threatened. Rumors spread quietly, shaping themselves into warnings. A few residents withdrew completely, avoiding eye contact, changing schedules. Others leaned harder into their respect for authority, as if belief alone could keep consequences away. The investigator understood the danger of pushing too fast. Men like these were not exposed by force. They were revealed through fractures, through the slow erosion of certainty. Still, he felt the weight of time pressing in. Each day without progress strengthened the illusion of untouchability. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the desert, he stood outside a community building, watching the lights go out one by one. Inside, laughter echoed faintly. Life continued, comfortably insulated from disruption. Somewhere within that ease, truth waited, deliberately hidden. He made a note to speak with someone who had not yet been asked, someone on the margins, someone who had less to lose. Silence like this was never accidental. It was maintained, and eventually, maintenance failed. The town had protected its men well, but protection always came at a cost. Soon someone would have to decide whether keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. By the time the investigator began lining up alibis, the case felt less like a mystery and more like a performance everyone knew by heart. Stories arrived polished, rehearsed, delivered with calm confidence. Each one fit neatly on its own. None of them fit together. He started with timelines. Who had been where and when? Answers came quickly, almost eagerly. Too quickly. Men spoke of meetings, errands, late phone calls, all placing them safely elsewhere during the hours that mattered. The details were precise, but precision can be learned. Memory, when shared often enough, becomes agreement. In one interview, a man leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head. "I told you already," he said gently. "I wasn't anywhere near that road." His tone was patient, almost kind, as if reassuring a confused child. The investigator noted how easily confidence replaced proof. Another conversation took place in a parked car, windows rolled up despite the heat. The voice inside trembled. "I don't remember it that way," a woman whispered. "I thought I did, but now I'm not sure." Her uncertainty felt cultivated, shaped by repetition and fear. Doubt had been planted and carefully watered. No alibi directly contradicted another. They overlapped just enough to leave no gaps wide enough for truth to slip through. It was as if everyone had agreed on the shape of the lie without ever discussing its details. Collective denial did not require coordination, it required loyalty. The investigator felt it most strongly in the pauses, in the moments before answers arrived. People were not recalling events, they were choosing which version of themselves to present. Guilt did not always reveal itself through panic. Sometimes it settled into calm routine. The sheriff sat in on several interviews, arms crossed, expression neutral. When inconsistencies appeared, he redirected gently, smoothing rough edges before they could cut too deeply. "Memory's tricky," he said once, with a thin smile. "Stress does that." The statement landed like a warning. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted quietly. Phone calls were made. Conversations ended abruptly when the investigator entered a room. People who had once spoken freely now requested lawyers or simply declined to talk further. Cooperation shifted into compliance, rigid and minimal. At night, the investigator reviewed transcripts, circling phrases that appeared too often, words that mirrored each other across separate statements. He recognized the language of emotional manipulation. Blame turned inward, responsibility dissolved into confusion. No one claimed certainty, yet everyone defended the same conclusion. Tara's absence hovered over it all, unnamed but present. Her voice was missing from every account, replaced by interpretations offered on her behalf. She was described as reckless, naive, difficult. Each label softened the impact of what might have been done to her. If she was flawed, then harm became understandable. One afternoon, the investigator confronted a man whose timeline shifted subtly with each retelling. "Which version is true?" he asked quietly. The response came after a long pause. "The one that matters," the man replied, eyes steady. It was not a confession. It was an admission of allegiance. No charges followed. There was not enough evidence, not enough clarity, not enough certainty. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it stalled. The lie held firm, reinforced by shared interest and mutual protection. As the days passed, the investigator understood that this was no longer about uncovering a single falsehood. It was about dismantling a structure built on silence. The town had chosen its story, and everyone was playing their part. But lies require constant attention. They fray under pressure. Somewhere within this agreement, someone was carrying more than they could bear. The question was never if the lie would break, only who would break first, and how much damage would follow when it finally did inside them.
The lie had begun to crack, and everyone could feel it. Mentioning Tara's name no longer sounded like concern, it sounded like accusation. Conversations stalled when she was brought up, as if the air itself had thickened. People glanced over their shoulders before speaking, then chose silence instead. Her name carried weight now, and weight meant risk. Witnesses who had once hinted at uncertainty began to retract. Memories blurred further, smoothed down until nothing sharp remained. Statements changed subtly, then completely. "I must have been mistaken," became a common refrain. The truth did not disappear all at once. It retreated, step by careful step. Relationships began to fracture under the strain. Long-standing friendships grew brittle. Husbands and wives argued late into the night, voices low but edged with fear. Parents warned children to keep quiet, to stay away from certain roads, certain people, certain questions. Protection and control tangled together until neither could be separated. One woman stopped sleeping entirely. She had spoken too much early on, offered observation she could not take back. Now her hand shook constantly, a tremor she tried and failed to hide. She flinched at sudden sounds. Dark circles hollowed her eyes. Guilt pressed on her chest until breathing felt like work. The investigator noticed the change immediately. When he visited her home, she barely opened the door. "I shouldn't have said anything," she whispered, words tumbling over each other. "I didn't see anything. I don't know anything." Her denial was frantic, rehearsed, desperate to erase the past. Days later, she was gone. Her house emptied overnight, furniture abandoned, curtains left open. Neighbors claimed ignorance. Some said she had family elsewhere. Others said she needed a fresh start. No one admitted to helping her leave. No one admitted to noticing when she packed. Paranoia settled in its place. People checked mirrors more often. They watched who spoke to whom. A casual glance felt loaded with meaning. Guilt manifested physically, turning stomachs, tightening jaws, locking muscles in place. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. The investigator felt the shift in tone everywhere he went. Doors closed faster. Smiles no longer reached eyes. He was no longer an outsider seeking answers. He was a threat to carefully maintained order. His presence reminded the town that lies were fragile things. Tara's name became something people avoided entirely. She was referred to obliquely as that girl or the situation. Distance made it easier to survive. If she was not named, then perhaps she could not demand accountability. Erasing her from language felt like erasing responsibility itself. At night, the investigator reviewed his notes, tracking patterns of fear rather than facts. Sleeplessness, sudden relocations, unexplained illnesses. These were not coincidences. They were symptoms. Truth, when suppressed, found other ways to surface. He realized then that the town was no longer hiding from him. It was hiding from itself. Fear had replaced curiosity. Silence had become self-preservation. The cost of speaking now outweighed the cost of knowing. Everyone understood the rules, even if no one admitted who had written them. Late one evening, he received a call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was strained, barely steady. "I can't live with it anymore," it said, "but I can't say it out loud either." The line went dead before he could respond. The investigator stared at the phone, pulse quickening. Someone was breaking. The pressure was working, but pressure always carried consequences. Confessions born of fear were dangerous, unstable, and often incomplete. Still, it was the first real crack in the silence. As the desert night settled in, he understood what came next would not be clean or controlled. When the truth finally emerged, it would come through damage, through collapse, through someone who could no longer hold themselves together. And when that happened, there would be no going back for any of them.
The phone call lingered long after it ended. The investigator did not rush to trace it. He waited, trusting fear to finish what pressure had started. When the knock finally came, it was soft, uncertain, as if the person on the other side hoped the door would remain closed. She stood there trembling, eyes rimmed red, shoulders drawn inward. He recognized her immediately. She had been on the edges of the case since the beginning, close enough to know things, distant enough to survive them. He let her inside without a word. "I can't stay long," she said, voice barely audible. They sat across from each other, the space between them heavy. He did not record the conversation. He did not interrupt. He waited. "I didn't hurt her," she said quickly, as if rehearsed. "I swear I didn't." Her hands twisted together, knuckles white. "But I knew something was wrong." The confession came in pieces. She spoke of favors disguised as kindness, of attention that felt special until it didn't, of warnings framed as advice. "He said it would ruin everything," she whispered. "My job, my family, my life." She never named him. She didn't have to. Her silence, she admitted, had not been accidental. It had been negotiated, slowly, reinforced through fear and reward. Each time she considered speaking, she was reminded of what she would lose. Over time, fear became routine. Silence became survival. "I told myself it wasn't my place," she said, "that someone else would stop it." Her voice cracked. No one ever did. The investigator asked only one question. Who else knew? She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "Enough," she said. "Too many." What she offered was not evidence, it was context. It sketched the outline of a system that relied on obedience and silence, a system that did not need violence to function, only compliance. When she stood to leave, her legs nearly gave out. "If you use this," she said, fear sharpening her words, "they'll know it was me." He nodded. He understood the risk she had already taken. After she left, the room felt altered, charged. Justice no longer felt distant, it felt volatile. Words spread quickly, though no one spoke openly. Something had shifted. Phones rang unanswered, meetings were canceled. The men who once moved easily through town grew cautious, watching shadows, measuring glances. Power, when threatened, became unpredictable. The investigator filed what he could, knowing it was insufficient. Partial confessions rarely survived scrutiny.
Without names, without proof, the law hesitated. But truth did not need permission to exist. That night, the investigator dreamed of closed mouths and open eyes, of people screaming without sound. He woke before dawn, pulse racing, aware that the most dangerous phase had begun. Someone had stepped forward, and that could not be undone. Silence had been broken, if only briefly. Now the town faced a choice it had avoided for too long. Fear spread quietly, threading itself through routines and rituals. The confession, incomplete as it was, unsettled people who had convinced themselves they were invisible. Old assurances lost their strength. Promises once trusted now sounded conditional, fragile. The town's balance shifted, and those who benefited most from silence felt it immediately. Some reached for control, issuing subtle reminders of consequence. Others retreated, preparing exits that had always been possible but never necessary before. The fragile woman's words echoed where they were least welcome, forcing recognition without granting relief. The investigator understood this was the cost of partial truth. It illuminated danger without neutralizing it. It exposed fault lines without offering resolution, and yet it was enough to change the direction of everything that followed. What came next would test loyalty, endurance, and fear itself. The truth was no longer buried. It was moving, unstable, and alive, and it would demand more than anyone was ready to give. And once awakened, it would not rest quietly again for anyone involved.
The confession did not unlock the case the way people imagined it would. Instead, it slowed everything down. Evidence gathered over months sat in boxes, labeled carefully and explained poorly. Statements contradicted one another without collapsing entirely. Memories bent under pressure, reshaped by fear, repetition, and time. The law demanded clarity, but clarity refused to appear. The investigator felt the weight of that contradiction daily. He could see the outline of what had happened without being able to prove it beyond doubt. Circumstances suggested wrongdoing, behavior suggested guilt, but suggestion was not enough. Justice required something solid, something undeniable, and the truth they were circling had learned to survive without either. Witnesses hesitated when pressed, then retreated behind uncertainty. Some genuinely no longer trusted their own recollections. Others hid behind confusion that had been taught to them intentionally. The past became unstable, unreliable, as if memory itself were complicit. The investigator faced growing pressure from above. Close the case, they said. There was not enough. There would be no charges without names, no trial without proof. The system was doing what it was designed to do: protect against mistakes, protect against accusations that could not be sustained. But protection had a cost. It protected the living at the expense of the truth. It allowed silence to remain legal, if not moral. The investigator knew that exposing everything would destroy lives. Some of those lives belonged to people who had never harmed anyone. Others belonged to those who had hidden behind systems and smiles. At night, he reviewed the fragments again. The photograph, the journal entries, the half-confession. None of it was enough alone. Together, they formed a story the court would never hear. He thought of Tara as a person, not a case. Her voice was absent, but her presence remained, felt in every decision he delayed and every file he left open. Justice asked him to stop. Truth asked him to continue. In the end, he did neither completely. The case remained open officially, while quietly losing momentum. Leads dried up, funding shifted, attention moved on. That was how systems failed without admitting it. Still, the investigator held on to the fragments. He documented what he could, preserved what others wanted forgotten. He knew time would be unkind to memory, but sometimes it loosened tongues too. Justice might never come for Tara, not in the way people expected, but truth had its own gravity. It waited patiently for weakness, for guilt to outweigh fear. As the town settled back into routine, the investigator felt the question pressing harder: protect the living or expose the dead. He understood now that whatever choice he made would leave damage behind. The story was not over. It had only changed shape. Somewhere beneath the silence, another fracture was forming, and when it surfaced, it would not be gentle. It would arrive quietly, through hesitation, through someone who could no longer carry the weight of what they knew. The investigator sensed it in the pauses he heard on phone lines, in the glances that lingered too long. Justice might demand certainty, but truth only required one moment of honesty, and that moment, once chosen, could not be taken back. He closed the file for the night, knowing sleep would not come easily. Tomorrow would bring more waiting, more silence, more restraint. But pressure never disappeared. It only moved inward until someone broke under it completely. When that happened, the town would no longer be able to pretend nothing had ever been wrong, and justice, whatever form it took, would be forced to speak. The investigator drove beyond town, where pavement dissolved into dust and heat. Roads stretched without promise, repeating themselves until direction lost meaning. The desert held silence differently, heavy and patient. Here, absence felt older than memory, as if disappearance were a natural process, not a crime demanding explanation, quietly here. He stopped near a shallow wash, stepping out into wind that carried nothing but grit. He imagined Tara here, moving through brightness, voice swallowed by distance. Memory supplied what evidence could not. The land offered no markers, only space where answers dissolved under sun, and time kept its secrets buried. New information arrived without ceremony, a tip passed hand to hand, cautious and incomplete. It suggested a route, a vehicle, a stretch of road avoided by daylight. Nothing proved, everything implied. The investigator listened, recording shapes rather than claims, knowing implication was all that remained between facts and fading recollection. He walked along the shoulder, boots crunching softly, imagining moments that left no trace. Fear does not announce itself in open spaces, it settles quietly. Tara's voice existed only in remembered sentences, half finished, interrupted by static. The desert accepted those fragments without judgment, holding them beyond reach, beyond recovery. At dusk, heat released its grip, revealing a colder emptiness underneath. The sky whitened, indifferent. He pictured a van stopping, doors opening, then closing again. Imagination filled gaps law could not cross. Loss, not certainty, was the dominant fact written across the land and remembered by those left waiting, alone. The investigator thought of Tara's mother, still watching roads that never returned what they took. The desert mirrored grief, vast, repetitive, unresponsive. No body emerged, no ending arrived. Only probability, heavy and unresolved, settled like dust on every theory he carried back toward town at nightfall, quietly, relentlessly, without mercy. He recorded the tip carefully, knowing it would not survive scrutiny. Courts required bones, dates, certainty. The desert offered none. It offered likelihood and loss, shadows and silence. Tara existed now as a presence shaped by what was missing, felt more strongly than any proof ever, anywhere, anymore for anyone. Memory intruded without permission, laughter on a bike, arguments unfinished, hope deferred. These were not evidence, yet they endured. The investigator let them surface, understanding that loss was cumulative. Each remembered detail deepens absence, turning the landscape into an echo chamber of regret, where grief repeated itself endlessly, unanswered, aloud. Night arrived cleanly, stars sharp and distant. He stood listening to nothing, aware that endings rarely announce themselves. Somewhere a decision had been made long ago. The desert kept that decision intact, preserved by heat and time, immune to questions asked too late by those still searching, still hoping, quietly. Driving back, he understood the investigation had reached a different terrain. Answers would not come from soil or steel. They would come from people carrying weight they could no longer hold. The desert kept what it took. The town would decide what it was willing to release next, soon, painfully. Loss settled heavier than evidence ever could. The investigator filed reports with careful restraint, noting likelihoods, avoiding conclusions. He knew families needed endings, not probabilities. Still, he preserved what mattered. Somewhere between dunes and streets, truth waited, incomplete yet persistent, refusing to vanish entirely despite distance, fear, silence, denial, time. As he left the desert behind, dawn hinted at return, pale and uncertain. Nothing had been resolved, yet something had shifted. Loss had been named. That mattered. The land would keep its secrets, but people could not forever. Pressure moved inward, toward voices still unbroken, waiting, listening, trembling, near confession. He knew the next fracture would not come from earth, but from a person reaching collapse. The desert kept bodies in metal. People kept guilt. Eventually guilt demanded hair. As he drove, he prepared for what followed, testimony born of damage, and consequences no one could control when truth surfaced. The fracture came quietly, as these things often do, not with arrests or sirens, but with resignation. Files were archived, meetings stopped. The case did not end so much as it was set down, gently, like something too fragile to carry further without breaking everything else. The investigator remained in town longer than necessary. He watched routines resume, altered only slightly. The men who had been careful before became comfortable again. Power returned to its familiar shape, protected by time and collective fatigue. Nothing official named them guilty. Nothing ever would. Others were not so fortunate. Some carried guilt openly,
etched into their faces and bodies. They moved through life smaller than before, haunted by the knowledge they had survived by staying silent. Sleep never came easily again. Hands shook at sudden noises. Every unanswered phone call felt like judgment. One woman never returned to town. Another drank herself into invisibility. A marriage collapsed under the weight of secrets neither side could forgive. These were not legal consequences. They were personal sentences, served daily without parole. Tara's mother aged quickly. Grief became her constant companion, reshaping her days and narrowing her world. She learned how to live around absence, how to breathe through it, how to accept that answers were not promised to those who deserved them. The waiting never ended. It simply changed shape. The investigator visited her once more before leaving. They spoke carefully, honestly. He did not offer closure. He offered respect. She thanked him anyway, because sometimes effort was all that remained when outcomes failed. Tara existed now only through memory, not as a photograph or a headline, but as a person remembered differently by everyone who had known her. To some, she was a regret. To others, a warning. To a few, a burden they would carry quietly for the rest of their lives. The town did what towns always do. It adjusted. New families arrived who did not know the history. Children grew up hearing only fragments, softened and incomplete. Silence became tradition. The story survived in looks exchanged, in topics avoided, in roads no one mentioned after dark. The investigator understood something then that had taken years to accept. Truth was not a cure. It did not heal automatically. Sometimes it simply revealed the damage already done and asked people to live with it. You want justice to look like resolution, like balance restored, like someone paying a visible price. But more often, justice is uneven, partial, unsatisfying, and truth, when it comes at all, arrives with consequences no one can control. Knowing changes you. It demands responsibility, even when action is impossible. It isolates. It lingers. Some truths protect the living. Others destroy what little stability exists. Deciding which truth to pursue is a moral choice, not a legal one. The case of Calico did not end with certainty. It ended with understanding, fractured and incomplete. It left behind a town shaped by what it refused to say, and people shaped by what they could not forget. So the question remains, long after files are closed and attention fades. Is the truth worth chasing when it costs relationships, safety, and peace? When it spares the powerful and punishes the fragile? When knowing changes nothing except the weight you carry? There are no clean answers, only choices, and the cost of making them. Some pay with silence, others with guilt, and some, like Tara, pay with everything, while the world learns to live around the space they left behind forever, whether we admit it at all.